Venezuela was once the richest country in South America, the most prosperous, the most stable. Citizens enjoyed free health care, free education, and one of the highest standards of living on the continent. Today, Venezuela is a catastrophe. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency, millions fled the country, grocery stores sit empty, hospitals lack basic supplies. A nation that was swimming in oil wealth now can't keep the lights on. How does the richest country in South America become one of the poorest nations on Earth in just 2 decades? That's the question this video will answer. But to understand how Venezuela fell, we need to go back, way back, to the beginning. This channel dives deep into the rise and fall of nations, and Venezuela's story is one of the most dramatic collapses in modern history. So let's start at the very beginning, before Venezuela was Venezuela, before the Spanish arrived, before oil was discovered. We're talking about the indigenous peoples who lived on this land for thousands of years, the indigenous era. When the Spanish first arrived in what would become Venezuela in 1498, the land wasn't empty, far from it. The region was home to numerous indigenous groups. The Caribs lived along the coast, the Arawaks inhabited the islands, the Tomotoquicas built agricultural societies in the Andes Mountains. The Yanomami lived deep in the Amazon rainforest. These weren't primitive societies. They had complex social structures, trade networks, and agricultural systems. The Tomotoquicas terraced the mountainsides for farming. The Caribs were skilled navigators who traveled between islands in large canoes. But unlike the Aztecs or the Incas, the indigenous peoples of Venezuela never built massive empires. No great cities, no centralized kingdoms. Instead, they lived in smaller, decentralized communities. This would matter later, because when the Spanish arrived, they didn't find gold-filled temples or wealthy emperors to conquer. They found scattered villages and modest communities. And that initial disappointment would shape how Spain treated this colony for the next 300 years. The Spanish arrive. Christopher Columbus was the first European to see Venezuela. During his third voyage in 1498, he spotted the coast. He called it Tierra de Gracia, Land of Grace. The following year, Spanish explorer Alonso de Ojeda arrived with Amerigo Vespucci. They saw indigenous houses built on stilts over Lake Maracaibo. The structures reminded them of Venice, so they called it Venezuela. Little Venice, the name stuck. But the Spanish quickly realized something disappointing. There was no gold here, no silver, no massive indigenous empires to plunder. Other Spanish colonies like Mexico and Peru were making Spain rich. Venezuela? Venezuela was an afterthought. For decades, the Spanish mostly ignored Venezuela. A few coastal settlements popped up. Coro was founded in 1527, Caracas in 1567. But these were small, struggling outposts. The real colonization didn't begin until the Spanish realized something valuable: the land itself. The coastal valleys had rich soil. The climate was perfect for growing cacao, coffee, and tobacco. Suddenly, Venezuela had value. But there was a problem. The Spanish needed labor, lots of it. The indigenous population was declining rapidly. Disease, warfare, and forced labor killed hundreds of thousands. The Spanish needed workers, so they turned to the same solution used throughout the Americas: slavery. Slavery in colonial society. Starting in the 1600s, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to Venezuela. They worked the cacao plantations. They grew tobacco. They built the colonial economy. By the 1700s, Venezuela had become one of Spain's most profitable colonies, not because of gold, but because of agriculture. Cacao, especially. Venezuelan cacao was considered the finest in the world. European chocolate makers demanded it. The profits flowed back to Spain, but this wealth created a deeply unequal society. At the top, a small elite of Spanish-born colonists called peninsulares. They controlled the land, the wealth, the power. Below them, the criollos, people of Spanish descent born in Venezuela. They were wealthy, educated, and owned land. But they resented the peninsulares who looked down on them. Below them, the pardos, mixed-race people. Some were free, some were enslaved. They had limited rights, limited opportunities. At the bottom, enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, they had no rights at all. This hierarchy created tension. The criollos especially felt frustrated. They did the work of building the colony, but the peninsulares controlled everything. By the late 1700s, new ideas were spreading. Ideas about liberty, equality, democracy. The American Revolution happened in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789. These ideas reached Venezuela, and they planted seeds. Seeds that would grow into revolution. The man who freed a continent. One man would change everything. His name was Simón Bolívar. Born in Caracas in 1783 to one of the wealthiest families in Venezuela, Bolívar grew up surrounded by privilege. His family owned plantations, mines, and slaves. Young Simón wanted for nothing. But tragedy struck early. His father died when he was 3. His mother died when he was 9. By age 16, Bolívar was one of the richest orphans in South America. He traveled to Europe. He studied in Spain. He read the Enlightenment philosophers. He witnessed Napoleon's rise to power, and he started asking dangerous questions. Why should Spain rule Venezuela? Why should a king thousands of miles away control the fate of millions? In 1807, standing on a hill in Rome, Bolívar made a vow. He would free South America from Spanish rule or die trying. He would keep that promise, but the cost would be unimaginable. The independence wars begin. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain. The Spanish king was overthrown. Suddenly, the colonies had a question. Who were they loyal to? Venezuelan criollos saw an opportunity. If Spain was weak, maybe this was the moment to break free. On April 19, 1810, Venezuelan elites in Caracas overthrew the Spanish governor. They declared a junta, a local government. Not quite independent, but close. Simón Bolívar was there. So was his mentor, Francisco de Miranda, an older revolutionary who had fought in the American and French revolutions. On July 5, 1811, Venezuela officially declared independence, the first South American nation to do so. But declaring independence is easier than defending it. The Spanish struck back, hard. The colonial government in Caracas collapsed within a year. Miranda was captured and died in a Spanish prison. Bolívar barely escaped with his life, but he didn't give up. Over the next 13 years, Bolívar would fight one of history's most brutal wars of independence, the brutal war for freedom. The Venezuelan War of Independence wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was savage. Bolívar's forces fought Spanish royalists, but they also fought other Venezuelans who remained loyal to Spain. Brother fought brother. Families were torn apart. The violence was extreme. Bolívar himself issued a decree in 1813, Decreto de Guerra a Muerte, decree of war to the death. Any Spaniard who didn't actively support independence would be killed. Any Venezuelan who supported Spain would be killed. It wasn't a war, it was exterminated. The Spanish responded with equal brutality. Entire towns were massacred. Prisoners were executed. Crops were burned. The Llaneros cowboys from the Venezuelan plains became key players. Initially, they fought for Spain under a brutal leader named José Tomás Boves. They terrorized Bolívar's forces. But eventually, a Llanero leader named José Antonio Páez switched sides. His cavalry became the backbone of Bolívar's army. The turning point came in 1819. Bolívar led his army on an impossible march. They crossed the Andes Mountains in the rainy season. Thousands of soldiers died from cold and exhaustion. But when they descended into Colombia, they caught the Spanish completely by surprise. Bolívar won a stunning victory at the Battle of Boyacá. Colombia was free. Venezuela would follow. On June 24, 1821, Bolívar's forces won the Battle of Carabobo. It was the decisive victory. Spain's grip on Venezuela was broken. By 1823, Spanish forces were completely expelled from Venezuela. After 13 years of war, Venezuela was finally free. But freedom came at a staggering cost. An estimated one-third of Venezuela's population died during the war. Entire regions were depopulated. The economy was destroyed. And the question remained, what comes next? Gran Colombia, Bolívar's dream. Bolívar didn't want Venezuela to be just another small country. He had a bigger vision. He dreamed of a united South America, one great nation stretching from Venezuela to Bolivia, strong enough to resist European powers, prosperous enough to rival the United States. In 1819, he created Gran Colombia, a union of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. Bolívar became president. Caracas and Bogotá alternated as capitals. For a few years, it seemed possible. Gran Colombia was huge, resource-rich. Bolívar was the most respected leader on the continent, but cracks appeared quickly. The different regions had different interests. Venezuelans resented being ruled from Bogotá. Regional leaders wanted autonomy. Bolívar's friend-turned-rival, José Antonio Páez, controlled Venezuela. He wanted independence from Gran Colombia. Bolívar tried to hold it together. He wrote constitutions. He negotiated. He pleaded. But it wasn't enough. In 1830, Venezuela seceded from Gran Colombia. Ecuador followed. Bolívar's dream collapsed. Devastated, sick with tuberculosis, Bolívar prepared to leave for exile in Europe. On his deathbed, he allegedly said, "America is ungovernable. Those who have served the revolution have plowed the sea." Simón Bolívar died on December 17, 1830, at age 47. The man who freed a continent died believing he had failed, but his legacy would endure. Today, Bolívar is revered throughout South America as El Libertador, the liberator. In Venezuela especially, his image is everywhere. His words are quoted constantly. Future leaders would invoke his name to justify everything from democracy to dictatorship. But in 1830, Venezuela faced a new challenge, building a nation from scratch. Century of chaos and caudillos. Venezuela spent the entire 19th century in chaos. Between 1830 and 1935, the country had 52 different governments. That's a new government every 2 years. Why so much instability? Because Venezuela never developed strong institutions. No functioning courts, no professional military, no clear rules for transferring power. Instead, Venezuela was ruled by caudillos, strongmen. Military leaders who seized power through force and held it until someone stronger came along. The pattern repeated endlessly. A caudillo would take power. He'd enrich himself and his supporters. Eventually, a rival caudillo would challenge him. Civil war, new caudillo in charge, repeat. The economy barely functioned. The population remained small and rural. Venezuela was poor, isolated, and violent. But one caudillo would change everything. Not because he was better than the others, but because during his reign, something extraordinary was discovered beneath Venezuelan soil. His name was Juan Vicente Gomez, and the discovery was oil. Juan Vicente Gomez, the tyrant who modernized Venezuela. Juan Vicente Gomez seized power in 1908. He ruled Venezuela for the next 27 years until his death in 1935. He was a dictator, brutal, corrupt, paranoid. Political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Freedom of speech didn't exist. Gomez controlled everything. But he also brought stability. For the first time in decades, Venezuela wasn't constantly at war with itself. And then came oil. Oil had been discovered in Venezuela in the 1870s, but it was difficult to extract. Nobody paid much attention. That changed in the early 1900s. New drilling technology made extraction easier. And in 1914, the first major oil well erupted near Lake Maracaibo. Foreign companies rushed in. American and European oil corporations signed contracts with Gomez. They drilled wells, built refineries, and exported millions of barrels. By the 1920s, Venezuela was the world's largest oil exporter. The government's revenue exploded. Gomez used that money to modernize. He built roads. He paid off the national debt. He professionalized the military. But he also became spectacularly corrupt. Gomez and his cronies owned much of the oil land. They took bribes from foreign companies. Gomez died as one of the richest men in South America. Oil transformed Venezuela's economy, but it also created a dangerous dependency. Venezuela stopped producing other goods. Why grow coffee when oil makes so much more money? Why develop industries when oil revenue could buy everything from abroad? This phenomenon has a name, the resource curse. Countries rich in natural resources often develop worse economically than countries without them. Why? Because resource wealth creates bad incentives. Leaders focus on controlling the resource rather than building functional institutions. Corruption flourishes. The economy becomes fragile. Venezuela was about to learn this lesson the hard way. When Gomez died in 1935, Venezuelans celebrated in the streets. The tyrant was finally gone. But the system he created, an economy completely dependent on oil, a government funded by oil revenue, a political culture built on patronage and corruption, that system remained. And it would shape every Venezuelan government for the next century. The democratic years, 1958, 1998. After Gomez, Venezuela stumbled through more instability, military coups, short-lived governments, another dictator named Marcos Pérez Jiménez from 1952 to 1958. But in 1958, something remarkable happened. A broad coalition of parties overthrew Pérez Jiménez and established democracy. For the next 40 years, Venezuela was a stable democracy, rare in Latin America, where military dictatorships were common. Two parties dominated: Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, and COPEI, Christian Democrats. They alternated power peacefully. Elections were free and fair. Venezuela became the envy of Latin America. While Chile suffered under Pinochet, Argentina under military juntas, Venezuela had democracy, and the oil money kept flowing. In the 1970s, oil prices skyrocketed. Venezuela's government revenue exploded. President Carlos Andrés Pérez promised, "Venezuela will be rich." The government spent lavishly: free healthcare, free education, subsidized food, subsidized gasoline, government jobs for everyone. Venezuelans enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Caracas glittered with new skyscrapers, shopping malls filled with imported goods. It seemed too good to be true. It was the beginning of the end. In the 1980s, oil prices collapsed. Suddenly, the government couldn't afford its promises. Venezuela had borrowed heavily, assuming oil prices would stay high. Now they couldn't pay the debt. The economy crashed. Inflation soared. The currency collapsed. In 1989, President Perez, elected for a second term, implemented austerity measures. Subsidies were cut. Gas prices increased. The IMF demanded reforms. Venezuelans were furious. They'd been promised prosperity. Now they were being told to tighten their belts. On February 27, 1989, riots erupted in Caracas. Poor Venezuelans poured into the streets, looting stores, burning vehicles. The military opened fire. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed. The event became known as El Caracazo, the Caracas Clash. It shattered Venezuelans' faith in democracy. If democracy meant poverty, corruption, and soldiers shooting protesters, what was the point? 3 years later, a young army officer named Hugo Chavez led a coup attempt against Perez. The coup failed. Chavez was imprisoned. But before being taken away, Chavez appeared on television. He told his supporters the coup had failed por ahora. For now, those 2 words electrified Venezuela. Here was someone who fought back, someone who challenged the corrupt system. Hugo Chavez became a hero, even from prison. 6 years later, in 1998, Chavez ran for president. He won in a landslide, and Venezuela would never be the same. The rise of Hugo Chavez, hero or villain. Hugo Chavez was born in 1954 in a small town in the Venezuelan plains. His family was poor. His parents were school teachers who struggled to feed their children. Chavez grew up with nothing. He joined the military because it offered a path out of poverty. In the army, Chavez read voraciously, Marx, Lenin, Bolívar. He became convinced that Venezuela's democracy was a sham, that the 2-party system was corrupt, that the elites had stolen the nation's wealth while the poor suffered. He wasn't entirely wrong. By the 1990s, Venezuelan democracy was deeply corrupt. Politicians enriched themselves. Oil revenue disappeared into offshore accounts. Poverty was rising. The middle class was shrinking. Venezuelans were angry, disillusioned, desperate for change. Chavez offered that change. He campaigned as an outsider, a man of the people. He promised to destroy the corrupt elite and build a new Venezuela. On December 6, 1998, Chavez won the presidential election with 56% of the vote. The elites panicked. The poor celebrated. When Chavez took office in February 1999, he moved quickly. He called for a new constitution. A referendum approved it. The new constitution gave the president vastly more power. Chavez called his ideology 21st century socialism. He nationalized industries. He redistributed land. He launched social programs called misiones, missions. Mission Robinson taught literacy. Mission Barrio Adentro provided free health care in poor neighborhoods. Mission Mercal sold subsidized food. For millions of poor Venezuelans, these programs were life-changing. For the first time, they had access to education, health care, and food. Chavez's supporters loved him. They called him El Comandante. They saw him as Bolívar reborn. But Chavez also attacked his opponents. He closed the opposition media. He jailed critics. He called the opposition oligarchs and fascists. Venezuela became deeply polarized. Half the country loved Chavez. Half hated him. In 2002, the opposition tried to overthrow him. A military coup briefly removed Chavez from power, but within 48 hours, massive protest brought him back. Chavez claimed the coup was backed by the United States. He became even more radical. He seized control of the state oil company, PDVSA. He fired thousands of workers who opposed him. He appointed loyalists with no oil expertise to run the company. Production began to decline, but oil prices were rising again. By 2008, oil hit $140 per barrel. Revenue poured in. Chavez spent it all, and then some. He gave oil to Cuba and other allies. He bought weapons from Russia. He funded social programs. It worked politically. Chavez won re-election in 2000, 2006, and 2012. But economically, the foundations were crumbling. Venezuela wasn't producing anything except oil. Food production declined. Manufacturing collapsed. The country imported almost everything. When oil prices were high, this worked. The government bought food and goods from abroad and distributed them cheaply. But what would happen when oil prices fell? The death of Chavez and the rise of Maduro. In 2011, Hugo Chavez announced he had cancer. He traveled to Cuba for treatment. For months, Venezuelans waited. Would Chavez survive? He did, temporarily. He won re-election in 2012, looking gaunt and weak. But on March 5, 2013, Hugo Chavez died. He was 58 years old. Venezuela mourned. Millions attended his funeral. Many genuinely loved him. To them, Chavez had given them dignity, education, and health care. But Chavez left behind a broken system, an economy dependent on high oil prices, institutions filled with loyalists rather than competent administrators, a political culture of division and confrontation. And he left behind a successor, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro had been Chavez's vice president, a former bus driver and union leader. Loyal? Yes. Charismatic? No. Where Chavez could captivate millions with a speech, Maduro was awkward, rambling. Where Chavez had political instincts, Maduro seemed clueless. But he was Chavez's chosen successor. And in April 2013, Maduro narrowly won the presidential election. The opposition cried fraud. Protests erupted. Maduro responded with force, and then disaster struck. In 2014, oil prices collapsed. From $100 per barrel to $30. Venezuela's revenue disappeared overnight. The economy imploded. The fastest economic collapse in modern history. What happened to Venezuela between 2014 and 2020 is almost unprecedented. A country that was one of the richest in Latin America became one of the poorest in the world in just 6 years. The numbers are staggering. GDP shrank by 75%. Imagine if the U.S. economy suddenly became the size of Texas. Inflation reached 1,000%, 1,000,000%. Money became worthless. A cup of coffee that cost 2 believers in 2012 cost 2 million believers in 2018. People stopped using money. They weighed cash instead of counting it. A stack of bills to buy bread was thicker than the bread itself. Venezuelans resorted to barter, eggs for diapers, milk for medicine. But the worst part wasn't the currency collapse. It was the shortages, empty shelves, and hunger. By 2016, grocery stores across Venezuela were empty. Shelves that once held food now held nothing. The government controlled the distribution of food, but there wasn't enough, so people waited in lines for hours, sometimes days. A woman might queue for 6 hours to buy 2 pounds of flour, if any was available. People lost weight. A study found the average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in 2017, not from dieting, from hunger. Malnutrition rates soared. Children's stomachs swelled from protein deficiency. Diseases that had been eradicated returned. Why was there no food? Because Venezuela had stopped producing it. Under Chavez and Maduro, the government seized private farms. They gave them to supporters who didn't know how to farm. Production collapsed. Venezuela imported food instead. But when oil revenue disappeared, they couldn't afford imports. So the people starved. The healthcare collapse. Venezuela once had excellent healthcare. Free, universal, accessible. By 2017, the healthcare system was in ruins. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. No gloves, no gauze, no antibiotics, no painkillers. Doctors performed surgeries without anesthesias. Patients brought their own supplies if they could find them. Infant mortality skyrocketed. Maternal mortality increased by 65%. Diseases Venezuela had eradicated returned. Malaria, measles, diphtheria. Doctors fled the country by the thousands. Why stay when you earn $10 a month and have no supplies to treat patients? One doctor interviewed in 2018 said, "We don't treat patients anymore. We just watch them die." The exodus. Venezuelans started leaving by the hundreds of thousands, then by the millions. They walked across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador. They traveled to Peru, Chile, Argentina. Many walked for weeks, carrying children, pushing strollers, dragging suitcases. They slept on roadsides. They begged for food. They crossed mountains and rivers. By 2024, over 7 million Venezuelans had fled the country, out of a population of 28 million. It's one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, comparable to Syria. But Syria was at war. Venezuela was at peace. There were no bombs, no foreign invasion, just mismanagement, corruption, ideology runs amok. Maduro's response, repression. As the economy collapsed, opposition to Maduro grew. Protests erupted across the country. In 2014, students took to the streets. Maduro sent in security forces. Dozens were killed. In 2017, protests intensified. For months, Venezuelans demonstrated. Maduro responded with brutal crackdowns. Over 120 people died. Opposition leaders were arrested. The most prominent, Leopoldo Lopez, was imprisoned on fabricated charges. In 2015, the opposition won a landslide victory in parliamentary elections. They controlled the National Assembly. Maduro's response? He created a new assembly, the Constituent Assembly, stacked with his supporters. He gave it power over the elected National Assembly. Democracy was dead. Elections became shams. Maduro banned opposition candidates. He manipulated vote counts. International observers called the elections fraudulent. But Maduro didn't care. He stayed in power. How? How Maduro survives. Most governments would fall if their economy shrank 75%, if millions fled, if people were starving. So why hasn't Maduro fallen? 3 reasons. First, the military. Maduro keeps the generals happy. He gives them control of industries. He lets them run smuggling operations. He pays them in dollars while everyone else earns worthless believers. The generals are corrupt, but they're rich. And as long as Maduro keeps them rich, they keep him in power. Second, foreign support. Cuba sends intelligence officers to help Maduro spy on opponents. Russia sells weapons and provides diplomatic cover. China loans money. These countries don't care about democracy. They care about having an ally in Latin America, so they keep Maduro afloat. Third, oil. Even though production has collapsed, Venezuela still exports oil. Maduro sells it, often at a discount, to countries willing to buy despite sanctions. That revenue, much smaller than before, keeps the regime functioning. Not the country, but the regime. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans suffer. Guaido, sanctions, and the power struggle. In January 2019, something extraordinary happened. Juan Guaido, a 35-year-old opposition leader and president of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president of Venezuela. His argument was legal. Maduro's 2018 re-election was fraudulent. Therefore, the presidency was vacant. Under the Constitution, the president of the National Assembly becomes interim president until new elections. Overnight, Guaido became a global figure. The United States recognized him as president. So did Canada, most of Europe, and much of Latin America. Suddenly, Venezuela had two presidents. Maduro controlling the military and government. Guaido recognized internationally but with no real power. The failed uprising. Guaido called on the military to defect. He promised amnesty to soldiers who switched sides. On April 30th, 2019, Guaido appeared on video standing outside a Caracas military base with soldiers behind him. This was it, the uprising. Except it wasn't. Only a handful of soldiers defected. The rest stayed loyal to Maduro. Within hours, the uprising fizzled. Guaido retreated. Maduro remained in power. Why didn't the military defect? Because the generals were making too much money. They weren't going to risk that for democracy. Guaido's momentum stalled. Over the next 2 years, his support dwindled. The opposition fractured. Some backed Guaido. Others said his strategy failed. By 2021, Guaido was still claiming to be president, but fewer people believed it. U.S. sanctions, helping or hurting? The United States imposed heavy sanctions on Venezuela, on Maduro personally, on Venezuelan oil, on government officials. The goal was to squeeze Maduro financially, force him to negotiate, maybe even force him out. Did it work? Maduro is still in power. So no. But the sanctions did hurt Venezuela's economy. Oil production fell further. The government had even less revenue. Critics argued the sanctions made life worse for ordinary Venezuelans while barely affecting the regime. Supporters countered that Maduro was already destroying the economy. Sanctions just prevented him from stealing more money. The debate continues, but one thing is clear. Sanctions alone haven't removed Maduro. Life under Maduro today. Today, Venezuela is a shell of what it was. The economy has stabilized slightly, not because of good policy, but because things can't get much worse. Inflation is still high, but not hyperinflation. The government adopted the US dollar informally. Many transactions now happen in dollars, not believers. This helped some. If you have dollars, you can buy things. Stores have goods again, for those with money. But most Venezuelans don't have dollars. They survive on less than $2 a day. Crime is rampant. Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates in the world. Kidnappings are common. Armed gangs control neighborhoods. The state is barely functional. Electricity blackouts last for hours, sometimes days. Water service is unreliable. Garbage piles up in the streets. Healthcare remains a disaster. COVID-19 hit Venezuela hard. The government barely acknowledged it. And politically, Maduro has cemented control. The opposition is weak, divided, demoralized. Some Venezuelans have given up hope. They just focus on surviving day to day. Others still dream of change, but they don't know how it will come. What went wrong? The lessons of Venezuela. So, what happened? How did Venezuela go from the richest country in South America to a failed state? The easy answer is to blame one person, Chavez or Maduro, but that's too simple. Venezuela's collapse has deeper roots. Let's break it down. Lesson 1, the resource curse. Venezuela's oil wealth was both a blessing and a curse. Oil revenue allowed the government to avoid difficult decisions. Why develop industries when you can just sell oil? Why improve education when you can import everything? But this created a fragile economy. When oil prices were high, everything was fine. When they collapsed, everything fell apart. Countries like Norway also have oil. But Norway invested the revenue wisely. It built a sovereign wealth fund. It maintained other industries. Venezuela spent every dollar. It never diversified. This is the resource curse. Natural wealth often leads to economic weakness. Lesson 2, corruption and weak institutions. Venezuela never built strong institutions. The courts were politicized. The military was corrupt. The legislature was weak. When Chavez came to power, instead of strengthening institutions, he destroyed them. He stacked the Supreme Court with loyalists. He gave the presidency unchecked power. He undermined the independence of PDVSA, the state oil company. Without strong institutions, everything depends on individuals. And individuals can be corrupt, incompetent, or authoritarian. Good institutions outlast bad leaders. Venezuela never had good institutions. Lesson 3, ideology over pragmatism. Chavez was an ideologue. He believed in socialism. He believed capitalism was evil. His policies reflected that. Price controls, nationalizations, expropriations. These policies sound good in theory. In practice, they destroyed the economy. Price controls created shortages. If the government says bread must cost 10 cents, but it costs 50 cents to make, bakers stopped making bread. Nationalizations scared away investment. Why invest in Venezuela if the government might seize your business? Expropriations destroyed agricultural production. Taking farms from experienced farmers and giving them to political supporters who didn't know farming was economic suicide. Ideology blinded Chavez and Maduro to reality. When policies failed, they blamed saboteurs, the United States, the oligarchy. They never admitted their ideas didn't work. Lesson 4. Populism's trap. Chavez was a populist. He promised everything. Free healthcare, free education, subsidized food, government jobs. And for a while he delivered. But populism has a trap. Promises are easy to make. Keeping them is hard. Chavez spent money he didn't have. When oil prices were high, debt was manageable. When prices fell, the bills came due. Populists also attack institutions. They claim only they represent the people. Courts, media, opposition, all are enemies. This concentrates power, and concentrated power leads to tyranny. Venezuela fell into the populist trap. Chavez built a cult of personality. Maduro tried to maintain it, but without institutions, without accountability, the system collapsed. Lesson 5. Division and polarization. Chavez divided Venezuela. Us versus them. The poor versus the rich. Revolutionaries versus oligarchs. This polarization poisoned politics. Compromise became impossible. Every issue became existential. When Maduro took over, he couldn't bridge the divide. He wasn't charismatic enough. So he doubled down on repression. Polarization destroyed any chance of fixing the country. The opposition refused to work with the government. The government refused to acknowledge opposition concerns. Venezuela couldn't solve problems because both sides were at war. Could it have been different? Could Venezuela have avoided this disaster? Yes, if Chavez had invested oil revenue wisely, if he'd maintained democratic institutions, if he'd been pragmatic instead of ideological, if Maduro had negotiated with the opposition, if he'd accepted help, if he'd prioritized people over power, but they didn't. And here we are. The future. Can Venezuela recover? The question everyone asks. Can Venezuela recover? The short answer, yes, but it will take decades. The long answer, it depends on what happens next. Scenario 1. Maduro stays. If Maduro remains in power, Venezuela will continue to stagnate. The economy might stabilize at this low level. Dollarization helps. Some private businesses are returning. But real recovery requires investment, rule of law, and political stability. None of that exists under Maduro. Venezuelans will continue leaving. The country will continue shrinking. Eventually, Maduro will die or be replaced. But without systemic change, the next leader will likely be another autocrat. Venezuela becomes another Cuba, poor, isolated, frozen in time. Scenario 2, democratic transition. The opposition could return to power through elections, negotiations, or military defection. A new democratic government could implement reforms, privatize industries, invite foreign investment, rebuild institutions. Venezuela has resources, oil, minerals, agricultural potential. With the right policies, recovery is possible. But rebuilding trust takes time. Investors are skeptical, the opposition is divided, and the military would resist reforms that threaten their profits. A democratic transition would be messy, but it's Venezuela's best hope. Scenario 3, continued chaos. Maybe Venezuela just continues as it is. Maduro in name, gangs in reality, state collapse. This is the worst scenario, but increasingly plausible. The government barely controls parts of the country. Armed groups run border regions. They smuggle drugs, people, contraband. Venezuela could become a failed state, like Somalia or Yemen. This would destabilize the entire region. Colombia, Brazil, and others would face refugee crises, drug trafficking, violence. The international community would be forced to intervene. But how? What about the Venezuelan people? Amidst all this, ordinary Venezuelans endure. They're incredibly resilient. They find ways to survive. They help each other. But resilience has limits. Millions have left. Those who remain are exhausted. They deserve better. They deserve a government that works for them. Lessons for the world. Venezuela's story matters beyond Venezuela. It's a warning. A warning about what happens when leaders prioritize ideology over reality. A warning about the resource curse. A warning about populism's dangers. A warning about destroying institutions. Other countries face similar temptations. Leaders who promise easy solutions, who blame elites or foreigners for problems, who undermines courts and media. Venezuela shows where that leads, the tragedy of Venezuela. Venezuela's collapse is tragic because it was preventable. This country had everything: oil, resources, an educated population, democracy. It should be thriving. Instead, it's a cautionary tale, but it's not too late. Venezuela can recover, but it requires change, real change, new leaders, new policies, new institutions. Whether that happens depends on Venezuelans themselves, and on whether the world pays attention. The entire history of Venezuela is a story of extremes: extreme wealth, extreme poverty, extreme hope, extreme despair. From indigenous peoples living in harmony with the land, to Spanish colonizers extracting wealth, to independence fighters dreaming of freedom, to cadillos fighting for power, to oil creating prosperity, to democracy flourishing, to socialism collapsing, to dictatorship crushing dissent. Venezuela has experienced it all. What comes next is still being written. Will it be a recovery or further decline? The answer depends on choices. Choices made by Venezuelans, choices made by leaders, choices made by the international community. Venezuela's history isn't over. This is just a chapter. And like all chapters, it will end. And a new one will begin. What that chapter holds, no one knows. But one thing is certain. Venezuela's story is far from finished. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and leave a comment with your thoughts on Venezuela. What do you think happens next? Can Venezuela recover?